Good morning and welcome to Inner West Council Library. We present an HSC lecture series in partnership with First Class Tutoring. But before all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land on which we produce this series, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and show my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Australian watching this series with us. Enjoy and good luck for your exam after a very, very hard year.
Welcome to the HSC lecture series. Today's videos will look at HSC Economics. There will be 2 videos, and the videos will go through exam technique, tips and traps. My name is Bill Burke, and hopefully through these videos I can share my teaching experience in economics and help you better prepare for the HSC exam. So the first video will look at the syllabus outcomes and course outcomes, so that as a student you know what you're going to be examined on and look at types of questions that the HSC exam will examine you on. The structure of the exam, a little bit about timing and marks that are allocated. Glossary of directive terms. We'll look at some best methods of study and look at what students have done in the past to prepare for HSC Economics. We'll look at using past papers as an effective revision tool. And there'll be a list of some resources and further help. The second video will look at exam technique. So the whole video, the second video, will look at planning and reading time, and we'll break down the exam into the sections, multiple choice, short answer questions, stimulus-based extended response, and the normal extended response question. The exam technique video will look at past papers, we'll look at sample answers and how to best tackle those questions. So we'll get started. So you should know that the HSC course is comprised of 4 main topics. So when you look at the 4 topics, it's like half the course looks at the global economy, and within that, Australia's place in the global economy. And then you will look at economic issues, so the main economic issues, and then the policies and management that together go with those issues. We can see there, they are the 6 key issues. And the reason why I'm singling those out is that they seem to be integrated throughout the course. So I know you do it separately as a separate topic, and you're probably doing that topic at the moment. But those key issues of economic growth, inflation, unemployment, external stability, distribution of income and wealth, and environmental sustainability seem to be a key focus throughout the HSC course, and specifically looking at those units, when you're studying those. So basically, the HSC covers, for economics, covers the syllabus. So you can see here that the learn about, so the learn about is the topic areas or the content. And then, when you're going through the course with your teachers, the teachers will have a look at this learn to component. So the learn to component looks at the skills and the knowledge outcomes and what you basically do with the content that you're learning, okay? And as we've already said, that key feature is the economic issues of the course. What you have in front of you there now is the complete course outcomes. Now, most times students sort of gloss over these outcomes, don't take too much notice. It's probably more important that teachers are focusing on these, but it's just important as a student as well to know what outcomes the course is covering in general, and then the specific outcomes for each unit. So when we have a look through, we can see this notion of economic terms and concepts. Teachers speak a lot about using those in your answers and understanding those. You should have the ability to analyse the economic role of individuals, firms, institutions and governments. Again, there's a stress in the course when it asks you to look at an economic impact that you are referring to these major groups in the economy? How do markets play a role in the global economy? The impact of these global markets upon Australia and the rest of the world. Being able to discuss a range of policy options to solve the issues. H6, analysing the impact of these policies in a theoretical and contemporary Australian context. Being able to evaluate the consequences of economic problems. Are you able to apply the terminology, the data, the contemporary issues, etc., in a range of contexts? The bottom four tend to be tested a lot in assessment, being able to select and organise your sources for reliability and relevance. How are you able to communicate these ideas? Are you able to apply mathematical concepts? And are you able to work independently in groups? So they're the main outcomes across the whole course. What we're going to have a look at now is per topic. So again, knowing your syllabus is an important part of all subjects and the study that you do for the HSC. So we spoke before about students learn to, and these are being that as a student, you're able to do these. So the learn about is the content, the learn to is what you're doing with the content. So in topic 1 in the global economy, you know, examining the effects of globalization on economic growth, quality of life, unemployment. So you notice that these issues are rising, even though it's a global economy topic, we've got external stability and inflation, unemployment. Are you able to assess the potential impact of the environment of continuing world economic development? Investigate the distribution of income and wealth globally, looking at the consequences of that. So again, that notion of issues across topics with the global economy and the effects of protectionist policies on the global economy. The skills that you're learning there, the economic skills, is being able to look at those statistics, interpret the statistics, evaluate the impact of those strategies there, and just move that out of the way. So looking at that, those particular skills. All right, topic 2, we've got Australia's place in the global economy. This particular unit is taking the global economy and applying Australia to it and looking specifically at how it affects Australia and how Australia's role in that economy. So the economic issues basically, again, around the impact of the global economy on Australia's trade and financial flows, the effects of changes in the value of the Australian dollar. Are you able to discuss the impact of free trade and protection? Are you able to propose likely changes to the structure of industry within Australia as a result of current trends in the global economy? So you can see the integration of the issues and your ability to look at those issues in a global context. The economic skills, we look at some calculations there on balance of payments, and I'm sure you've seen questions on those already, and we'll look at that later. This relationship between the balance of payments and the financial accounts. And again, the HSC questions could include questions which are very similar to these skills that they're asking you to do. Being able to explain the relationship between the accounts. Using supply and demand diagrams to explain how the value of the currency is determined under different exchange rate systems, and being able to analyse changes in the components of the balance of payments and how it impacts upon the value of the Australian dollar. So with topic 2, again, you've probably seen questions that look at particular skills that are in the Learn To part of the syllabus. And again, examiners would be looking at whole parts of the syllabus when setting questions. So they're setting questions focusing on the Learn About and the Learn To. Topic 3 is economic issues. So we've already spoken a bit about the issues already, and this particular topic looks in detail at those 6 specific economic issues. So the Learn 2 looks at arguments for and against increasing economic growth rates. The second dot point there, social and economic problems created by unemployment, being able to look at the effects of inflation on the economy, discuss the effect of continued current account deficit on an economy. So that's an issue around external stability, that's why it's sitting there. Investigate trends in the distribution of income and wealth and policies around that, looking at the economic and social costs around inequality in the distribution of income. And the last dot point there is examining the economic issues with the goal of ecological sustainable development. So you can see that each of those target, the 6 particular issues. The skills, the economic skills, look at the problems facing contemporary economies. So obviously those problems would be around the issues. We've got some mathematical calculations there around equilibrium, leakages and injections, and the simple multiplier. And then the unemployment rate, etc. Okay, so we'll look at that a little bit later of how we're dealing with the mathematical side of the economics, having a formula sheet and knowing those formulas and being able to use those to answer questions. We move on to topic 4. So again, we're looking at the Learn 2 part of the syllabus here for topic 4, being able to analyse the opportunity costs of economic decisions by government and particular problems and issues, and very topical at the moment with the COVID-19 virus and the impacts on unemployment and government spending, structural changes, so the microeconomic side, the supply side, economics, and looking at how the Australian economy is adjusting to those policies and the effect of those policies, applying economic theory and how government addresses the economic problem, and looking at specifically analysing the alternative ways to finance a budget deficit. And obviously at the moment, we know with the JobKeeper, JobSeeker and the COVID-19 relief stimulus package by the government, that budget deficit is definitely growing, and the way that the government's going to look at financing that and the implications of that. We can see down here the economic skills. So the first one here, being able to explain how governments are restricted in their ability to simultaneously achieve the objectives. So this is around the concept that there are a range of objectives and the government cannot solve those simultaneously. There will be a conflict, and working out or prioritising which ones to resolve first. We've got multiplier concepts again, looking at helping the government solve the problem or economic problems and issues. What are some of the limitations of these policies and the impact of these policies on the economy? And then down the bottom there, we can see how the use of macro and micro policies, explaining theories around that and this whole notion of the policy mix. So those 4 slides, really you should be paying attention and looking at those questions that are there, and they're shaped like questions, these Learn 2, and whether you're able to address those and answer those questions. Okay, so let's move on to the format of the exam. And again, this is probably just revision, just so that we know. So the multiple choice section, there's 20 multiple choice questions worth 20 marks. The timing that I've got here is 35 minutes. Now, from past experience, students would tend to do the multiple choice questions much quicker than that and allocate that leftover time to other parts of the exam. But just be conscious that mathematical timing there, the 35 minutes, is only based on the marks and the weighting value. multiple choice covers all topics. The short answers in total, there's 40 marks. So again, the 1 hour and 15 minutes is a suggested time based upon the weighting of 40 marks or 40% of the exam. There's 40% of the time. We know that there is parts to that. So there are 4 short answer questions broken down typically into A, B, C. So approximately 12 items in total there. So if we look at 4 questions, 3 parts, A, B, C for each one, there's 12 items in total. Section 3 is the stimulus-based extended response. This is 20 marks. The suggested time according to weight is 35 minutes, but typically students are spending between 40 and 45 minutes for this particular section. The question may again come from any part of the course. You will have 2 choices here, so there'll be a choice of 2 responses, and obviously you would select the one that you believe you can answer the best out of the alternatives given. Nessa is saying the approximate length is 800 words or typical 6 pages of writing. Section 4, extended response, essay type question. Again, 20 marks, timing, 35 minutes. We're probably saying that you should do 40 or 45 with some time saved in the first 2 sections of the paper, but again, we're not rushing those. There are a choice of 2 questions. So the difference with section 3 and section 4 is that section 3 has stimulus, graphs, tables, diagrams, quotes, etc. And section 4 doesn't, and the required length is approximately 800 words or 6 pages as well. The next part of the video is going to look at the glossary of key terms. I would imagine that your teachers in class have spent some time looking at these directive terms and understanding them. So looking at that first bullet point there, I always teach my students that in any exam, answering any question, that you're going to be marked and judged upon what you write and how you write it. So the what you write is the content. Okay, so that's the learn about. So the learn about content, and we've looked at the 4 topics, etc., that you've studied certain parts of the course, you know the content, you understand hopefully the content. The next part is you need to look at the question that's been asked to see what you need to do with the content. So that's the how. So the structure of your answer is going to be addressing the verb in the question. So the what you write, you definitely need to address the content related to that question. The how you write it really is dictated by the verb or the directive term. So the understanding of that directive term is very important to the way that you're going to structure the answer to the question. So get into the habit of underlining that key glossary term, writing above it, like what it actually means. And therefore, when you constantly look back at that question, you're going to know whether you've addressed that question the way that the examiners want you to do that. So you can see here we've got some directive terms: justify, explain, analyse and evaluate. So let's look at the explain type question. So this example here is a simple question: explain the causes of inflation and its effects on the Australian economy. So if I said to you, the 2 ways of the writing is the what to write and the how to write it. So what you're writing is an answer. Now this could be a 20-mark extended response, or it could, well, typically it would, looking at the nature of this question. So the topic is inflation. So the content is inflation. The content is the causes of inflation and the effects of that. Okay. So the question's asking you to explain. So explain is looking at the how and the why, or the cause and the effect, which you can see is already in the question. So when I'm reading your answer, I would imagine I'm reading about inflation, I'm reading about the types and the causes of inflation and the effects of that. So the effects of inflation would be things like how it impacts on economic growth and wages, you know, how it may have a detrimental effect on unemployment when you're looking at high inflation, and the impact of demand inflation and cost inflation, etc. So the way you would tackle this question is that you would address the causes and you would link specific causes to specific effects. And we'll look at the use of evidence and technical language and that a little bit later on. All right, so some of the main terms, and you can see here that these are the main ones that are typically used in economics. It's not exhaustive, there's others. There's a link there to the key directive terms from NESA. So an outline question could sketch in general terms, features of the content that you're looking at. We've got describe, calculate. There's going to be formulas, there's going to be calculations in economics, so you're going to be asked to calculate. But just knowing these key glossary terms will help you in shaping your answers to questions. So let's have a look at some of the major ones in terms of a discuss. So if you're looking at past HSC questions, discuss typically is used quite often in economics. It looks at issues and you're providing points for and or against. So typically students ask, do I need to look at both advantages and disadvantages? The simple answer is no, but probably a better answer that shows or demonstrates better understanding would be looking at both advantages and disadvantages, so the for and against arguments that are given to a particular topic. We've already had a look at this explain, this cause and effect, or the why and or how. So looking at the linkages between why that particular issue like inflation is caused and what impact that has. So let's move on to some higher order verbs or directive terms here. And one of the things you'll notice in allocation of marks is that the lower, I guess, directive terms, the lower order terms or verbs tend to have a lower weighting of mark as opposed to the higher order verbs, which typically are used in essay and 20-mark questions. So an analyze question asks you to identify the components, to look at the relationship and identify the relationship, but draw out these implications and relate the implications. So a higher order verb requiring you to do simply more than just explaining and more than just giving the features and characteristics. Examine simply means inquire into. So think about examine, that teachers at school give you an examination. They're inquiring, they're looking to see how much you know and what you've learnt. So an examine question, again, looking at the features and going into detail, looking at the relationships of whatever issue you're looking at. Justify. So if you're asked to justify, you know, you're giving reasons, you're supporting an argument or conclusion, and you're doing that typically with evidence. And we've got assess there, making a judgment. So again, an assessment, you know, teachers giving tests again as an assessment. We're judging, we're measuring what you understand, what you know. And in an economic setting, if we're assessing the impact of, say, economic policy on the economy, then we're making a judgment based on size, outcome, value, and of how those policies are working. And evaluate is another judgment verb, and that judgment verb based on criteria typically. So evaluations in economics, the criteria we can use there centers around things like evidence and statistics and opinion, etc. but the full range of those glossary terms are given on the NESA website. All right, so let's move into the best methods of study. So no doubt you've seen study notes. They're available from past students, internet, etc. But a good set of study notes obviously is going to be helpful in preparing for the HSC. So lots of students compare with past students. They go on the internet, they get those notes. Others look at textbooks for guidance, teachers in class, PowerPoint notes that teachers give you. So the main idea here is that you follow the syllabus headings, and you should also be trying to integrate up-to-date statistics and data into those study notes. Over the years, I've seen many different versions of study notes. Some students typically stick with the standard, the textbook notes, etc. Other students try to put a bit of their own flavour on those notes by having some sort of their own interpretive analysis of those notes within those study notes. So remember, study notes look at the content and the learn about, but exam questions typically require you to interpret those notes and that content. So that could be something that you think about. Obviously, check that you've covered all aspects of the syllabus. The study notes will obviously be done in sections and have subheadings. One of the ideas that students have, that I've taught, have been looking at, and I teach this, is about the chunking part of it. So when you're revising your study notes, you take sections of the syllabus and you would look at specific sections. So for example, if you're looking at balance of payments and the current account deficit, you might focus on chunking that section by looking at the causes and the consequences of a persistent CAD and possibly some of the strategies around that. And that sits in that topic 2 part of Australia and the global economy. So this idea is you've got your extensive study notes, but when you're studying from those study notes, you might target just specific components or chunks of that. I've got an example there of some study notes, and this particular student, what they've done is, and again, it's just a snapshot of it, is that they've put the area of the syllabus, so it's unemployment. They've got the subsection which looks at the measurement of it. And notice how they've taken the content, they've broken it down into some dot point, they've constructed their own table. So instead of writing the notes there that unemployment consists of people over 15 years of age who are employed for more than 1 hour per week, they've broken it down into table form. Now again, as a bit of a visual learner you might be, this makes it easier to condense the notes, but it also makes it easier possibly to read over and learn the notes. You will notice there's that this student has got their formulas put in this particular section of the syllabus. That's probably a screenshot there from the textbook. And again, it's clearly set out, it's manageable, easy to read, that when you print these notes out and you're sitting down there and you're studying from these notes and you're reading over them, or you're using those to complete past questions, they're fairly easy to access and to study from. All right, so the next part we're looking at is past papers. If you were to survey past students, and typically I do this every year, they say that the best advice is to do as many past papers as you can, and to do those under exam conditions typically, so to time your questions and your answers and to get feedback on that, okay? So I would say to you that if you're a student that's looking to improve, you have to do past papers. And I know teachers give those consistently to students, and you would need not only to do those, but do them under some sort of timed and exam condition. Because remember, you're checking to see whether you know that content and whether you're able to apply your knowledge of the content and getting feedback. So I always say, you know, make sure you've got good relationships with your teachers. And, you know, teachers are very hardworking people, and particularly for year 12, you know, they want to see you do well, and they will give you that feedback that you need to improve on your answers. Make some notes of areas that you're unsure on. So a typical thing that I say to students is go and do this past paper, get some feedback. You might think, geez, I'm not really sure on the consequences of the current account deficit. I might need to go back to my notes and have a look and have a reread of that. So that's that 0.7 there, and study that section. So I guess this notion of past papers is very good in consolidating your knowledge, working out what you do know and what areas that you need to improve on. And then that becomes a catalyst to go back and look at your notes and to, you know, to lock down those weaknesses and continuing that process. Okay. Sample answers, big fan of sample answers. To me, sample answers, they show you what's expected. They show you the standard. You can see the image here, and the HSC exam workbooks, they're not published every single year for every subject. Your local library, I've seen these around in local libraries, even your school library, your teachers probably have them as well. I think of the sample answers as two things: that one, to show you the standard and what's required, but number two, students can sometimes learn and fill in gaps from sample answers. I've given these to students in the past, and they think, and they say to you, look, oh, I haven't seen that before. Oh, that's a good example to use. I haven't seen that statistic. I'm going to put that into my study notes. I'm going to use that. So the sample answers are definitely very good to have a look at. I have a pool of sample answers that I typically give students, and we compare answers all the time. I even go as far as to give students sample answers that are not necessarily the best answers or your typically A response, which what these exam workbooks give you, and show you a range of different answers. And I get students to read it and say, okay, what mark would you give that? Do you think that's an A, B, C, or D? So it actually gets them looking at the marking process and to see what standard is required to receive those marks. And point number 10 there, teach someone the content. Study groups, you know, teaching others within that subject area. What it gets you to do is to think critically about what you're explaining and what you're teaching. And again, it helps to fill in gaps. You know, think about it. If you're struggling to articulate to someone how you're going to answer a particular question or to explain a concept, again, it's a pretty similar process in an exam of thinking about what you need to write and getting that down on paper. So teaching someone really does help to lock down that content. We're going into a bit more detail with these past papers, and I don't want to be repetitive here because I've said that, commented on this already, but the past papers are very useful, okay? And this notion here that if the content you learn really isn't going to help you much at all if you don't know how to answer the question. And one of the things about the past papers, it typically exposes you to a range of questions. You know, I hear students comment all the time, oh, I've done a similar question to that. Or that looks similar to this particular question. And there's no denying that the more past papers you look at from a multiple sources, so obviously you've got access to the NESA HSC papers. Some students are fortunate enough to get a hold of the CSSA, the Catholic school papers, because you're in a Catholic school or might know someone that has access to that, although there's some strict copyright around those papers. But there's a range of other independent papers, and independent people that write those papers that, again, that the teachers might and the schools might purchase and give to you to practice. The past papers as well, it helps you to take pressure off your exam. I guess, you know, students feel confident. I've done multiple past papers and questions. I'm very well prepared, and they go into trial exams and HSC exams with that confidence. And when they're reading questions, it's bringing back, I've seen a question similar to that. I've practiced that question. This is how I'm going to address that. So getting the most out of your past papers would be typically around these ideas. Time it, commit to doing those sections. And again, you don't have to sit down and do a 3-hour exam. Sit down and say, well, today I'm going to spend 20 minutes. I'm going to do the multiple choice questions under exam conditions. You know, the next day or so, I'm going to do these short answer questions. I'm going to have a go at doing this extended response. Get the feedback, pinpoint your weaknesses, and obviously strengthen those weaknesses by doing additional questions related to that. And again, there's no need to do the whole paper there. So hopefully you got some good advice there around these past papers. So I'm assuming that the next, if there's a question there, you would ask me, well, how do I get access to the past papers? So the Board of Studies, sorry, that should have been updated. That should be NESA. They have the HSC past papers. There's Catholic schools and independent papers. You can look on the right-hand side here and you can see that ACE HSC is typically a good source, and there's some good sources of papers that are around, you know, different subjects there, and there's course notes. The sample answers for resources, we've spoken about those. You've got the Cambridge publication. They've got HSC checkpoints, and they've got some quiz and apps there. Matthew Parsons, economics teacher during COVID, has very graciously opened up a lot of his online lessons and quizzes, etc. So it's a very generous offer by him, and you can access that at the moment. UBS Economics is another good source. The Art of Smart, very good website, and you can see the image over here on the right. Very good resources in this particular, on this website. And it breaks down questions like what I will do with you in these videos. And there's some very good material in there. Okay, and don't forget the quiz, NESA quiz down the bottom here. You can access that in all your subjects, multiple choice type questions. So they basically take the past papers and they put those into multiple choice type questions there. Okay, so this first video has basically looked at the outcomes and what's required, some tips around some study notes and resources, and make sure you watch the next video, because then we get into breaking down the exam paper and looking at sample answers and past questions there. Welcome back to our second HSC Economics video. This particular video will look at exam technique, and in particular go through the different aspects of the exam, using sample answers, giving tips of how to answer questions, looking at past responses, and basically helping you to answer questions more effectively. So the first thing you should consider is the planning and reading time in an exam. So during that 5 minutes of reading time, the suggestion is that you start backwards by looking at section 3 and section 4 first. The tendency for some students is to go straight to the multiple choice and read through each multiple choice question. The reasoning behind starting at the back of the exam and the longer answers in the exam, so the stimulus essay and the non-stimulus essay, is so that you can make a decision on which question you may like to do pretty much straight into the exam. So reading those two questions and making your mind up as to which question you wish to do, then that means that you're already starting to think about that longer answer. Then you should read the short answer questions, and if there's time left, you should read the multiple choice questions. Once the exam starts, the first 5 or 10 minutes in that exam, you should be planning. Okay, most students, when the exam starts, they just start with the multiple choice straight away. Okay, my suggestion is that you look at those 2 extended response questions and you're planning. You're planning on those pieces of paper that you already have in front of you that you're going to write your answer on. So the idea here is plan backwards, but you're completing the exam forward. The reasoning is, as you're doing the multiple choice questions first and then the short answers, you already have an understanding of what's coming later on in the exam. So in your mind, ticking over is that question about macroeconomic policy or current account deficit exchange rates, whatever it is. So you can then keep going back to that plan in your booklet, your writing booklet, as you think of ideas. So you read a multiple choice question on the current account, that information might be good. I'm going to put that, that's triggered a point that I write in my preparation, my planning booklet. So the idea is look at the multiple choice questions, or answer them, sorry, in order, but you've got a mind to the longer responses. All right, so let's look at the multiple choice questions, where they come from, typical type questions, and we'll have a look at some samples and how to answer those. All right, so you should know that multiple choice questions randomly come from the 4 particular topics. Now, because the 4 topics are weighted equally in terms of the marks and in terms of the teaching time, then there should be a spread of multiple choice questions in the exam. What do they cover? You know, teachers are always drilling you as a student about knowing the terms and concepts, having good detailed definitions of those, using those in your answers. So multiple choice questions could just pick up an idea, like a key term, such as exchange rates, and then they're testing you, do you know what that term means, through a multiple choice question. Looking through exams, expect diagrams and calculations. There's always multiple diagrams and calculations in the multiple choice paper. In the last few years, they've gone for these table type answers, and we'll have a look at that, or paired answers, where there are similar alternatives, but they just change the A, B, C, D of each one, and we'll have a look at how to answer those. Try to identify the answers before looking at the answers given. So read the question carefully, look at it, think, okay, I understand that term or that concept, then start looking for the answers there. The other technique is that typically you should be able to identify 1 and even 2 answers that are just totally wrong. So mathematically, if you eliminate those 2 answers, you're looking at 2 answers that are possibly left, and that's giving you a 50% chance then, as opposed to a 25% chance of getting that question right. Make sure you look at the stimulus and use the stimulus. It's obviously there for a reason. And this notion of identifying questions that you're not sure on. So I know some students on the actual exam question paper, when they're answering the questions and transferring on a multiple choice sheet, they might just put like a double tick to say, yep, I'm pretty sure that's right. 1 tick for I'm sure. Question marks for questions that you're not too sure on, and then you can revisit those at a later date. So just in a little bit more detail there, typical questions. So the key concepts that we spoke about: fiscal policy, exchange rates, marginal propensity to consume, tariffs, etc. So you should have a glossary and regular testing of those. So that could be something around just at the start of your study notes, key terms, and just constantly referring back to those. In the past, I've had students that have set up a formula page similar to mathematics, whereby you have from each of the 4 topics some of the key calculations and sample ways of working those out, or sample questions. So definitely make a formula page, and some of them are floating around. You might be able to find those or do them yourself. Interpreting diagrams, tables and statistics. Well, I mean, these are the skills in economics. So there's definitely going to be questions around things like tariffs and interpreting tariffs, quotas, Lorenz curve, aggregate demand, exchange rate movements. Look through past papers and you'll see plenty of those questions. The next one is that questions are around economic analysis to current issues. Okay, so tightening of monetary policy will cause, typically we're in a situation now where monetary policy and the cash rate is at its lowest levels. So interpreting, economic analysis of current issues and the reasoning. So which of the following could have caused the increase or an increase in aggregate demand? And then you've got to, go through the alternatives and to see which one would apply. All right, so let's have a look at some past questions. Last year's HSC Exam Question 1, you'll tend to notice that the examiners try to ease students into the exam. So usually the first question or so should be relatively easy. Now, looking at this particular question, which of the following is a feature of globalization? Just to come back to video 1 about knowing your syllabus and knowing it well, if we look down the bottom here, we can see that this is the extract from the syllabus that the question comes from, and looking at globalization. So we're looking at globalization down here, and then we can see the aspects that you should have notes and have learnt. Now, if we look down that list and then we go back up to our question, we can see there this International of Division of Labour as one of those key components of globalization. All right. Now, I said before about, knocking questions out that that you wouldn't think that are right. So your understanding of globalization is things like breaking down barriers and greater contact between nations and that economic integration. So when you look at something like decreased levels of economic integration, we know that typically that question would be wrong because it's the opposite. So some of the answers you see will be the opposite of what that key term is there. Okay, so just knowing your syllabus, again, could be worth marks. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So we spoke a little bit about calculations, all right? And some of the calculations can be a little bit tricky, and there could be multiple steps, like this question here. In this particular question, there are multiple calculations to derive the answer. So when we look at it, we've got national income and savings in billions of dollars, hypothetical economy. We've got our 2 years. We've got our income and S for our savings. Okay. So when you're looking at that, income, savings, consumption, etc., we go back to what we've learned in terms of, and we know that there's going to be a calculation. So we're looking at things like multiplier and the effect of the multiplier. So when we read the question, all things being equal, what is the new equilibrium level of income Y in year 3? So basically, we need to calculate what that next increase is going to be. Okay. Now, we can't just assume that's gone up by $200, so therefore it's going to go up by $200. All right. Even though lots of examples you've probably done, they have those same incremental changes. What we need to do is to work out this investment or change in aggregate demand by 35 billion will generate a change in national income. Okay, so when we look down the bottom here, these are our economic skills. So if you look at there, it says number 2, calculate equilibrium position for an economy using leakage and injections and looking at the simple multiplier effect of national income fluctuations in the economy. So that's where the question comes from. All right, so the first thing is you're going to need to work out what the change in national income is. That's the formula, Okay, so the question's asking you the new equilibrium level national income. You should know that there's two formulas here that clearly get used often, and that's the one in front of you and the multiplier. Now, change in national income, well, that's what we're trying to work out, aren't we? The multiplier times the change in aggregate demand. So let's have a look first at the multiplier. You should know that the multiplier is 1 over the MPS, or 1 over 1 minus the MPC. Now, we've got the savings data here, so we can clearly work that out. Again, going back to year 11, the MPS is the change in savings over the change in income. So the 50 over the 200 is the change. So 50 to 100, the change is 50 there. And from 250 to 450, the income change is 200. So that works out to be 0.25, okay, or a quarter. So the formula for the multiplier is 1 divided by 0.25, or a quarter, and that becomes 4 as the multiplier. So you should be pretty okay with calculating the multiplier. The next step is we have to put that back into our formula. So what we've created is the 35 billion, so the investment here of 35 billion times the multiplier has then come up with $140 billion change in national income. So the question is the new equilibrium level. So obviously with this question, we need to add the 140 with the 450 from year 2 up here to come up with the 590. So that particular question there, we need the formula for the change in national income. We need to work out the multiplier. We need then to add that to the existing data. So there's a fair bit of work there for a 1 marker. All right, let's have a look then at this example of a tabled question. So a table, see how the answers are set up in a table. Sometimes there could be 2, like in this one, there could be 3, etc. All right, so in terms of this particular question, so we've got a stimulus. The Australian government provides financial aid to build a road in a neighbouring country. Residents in Australia receive pension payments from overseas. So we've got to use that stimulus to answer the question, how will these debit and credit transactions be recorded in Australia's balance of payments? So again, you should have done lots of work on the components of the balance of payments, what constitutes a debit and a credit. So simply looking, first of all, what's your idea of a debit or credit? Okay, so typically a debit transaction is money leaving Australia, and a credit transaction is money coming into Australia. And obviously we've got our 2 accounts, the current account on the left and the capital and financial account on the right. Okay, so with this particular question here, you would say, therefore, we're looking at financial aid to build a road in neighbouring country. So what's happening is Australia is receiving, so residents in Australia receive pension payments from overseas, okay? So obviously the money coming into Australia is a credit transaction. So residents in Australia receive pensions payments from overseas, and the other one is Australian government provides financial aids to build a road. Okay, so let's start with the first part of the question. The Australian government provides the financial aid. That means that's money going out of Australia. Okay, so they're giving money. So money going out is a debit. All right, so we'll have a look at the debit account. Is it secondary income or is it a capital account? So you should know that financial aid is a capital account item. Okay, so therefore, in this particular question, okay, we can knock out A because it's not secondary income, and we can knock out D. So that's just for the debit side of the question. All right, the second part of the question is that residents in Australia receive pension payments from overseas. Okay, so that's a credit as there's money coming in. Now, can you distinguish between a primary income and secondary income? And remittances or pensions or payments that come from overseas is a secondary account item. Okay, so when we put these two together, Therefore, B gets knocked out, and that process of elimination of C is the answer. Okay, so our next question here is a diagram question. So you've probably seen this many times. So you look at the diagram, you read it, it says it's the demand for and supply of Australian dollars. Okay, so first of all, we look at see what's happening with the curve. So we've got a supply and demand curve, and we've got a change in demand, and we know that from D to D1. So let's read the question. Which of the following statements is most likely to explain the change in the equilibrium value of the Australian dollar illustrated in the diagram? All right, so first of all, we know that there is an decrease in demand. It's a shift to the left. The other key word is we're looking at the change in equilibrium, okay? So the change in equilibrium, if we go to our original supply and demand curve and we take that across there, that's our exchange rate at that particular point there, okay? The change in demand is a decrease, and therefore that's our new equilibrium level. So first of all, we can ascertain that the exchange rate or the price of the currency, so our price here, has decreased. Now we know that as a depreciation, okay? So when we're looking at our answers, even though it's not in tabular form, it's saying that the Australian dollar has appreciated or depreciated, okay? So we can immediately knock out A, okay, and C. Now, the reasoning behind that is that in this particular question, the exchange rate has depreciated. All right, so once we've done that, then we have a look at our other options. So it has depreciated because of reduced microeconomic reform in the US economy, or I'll just move the cursor there, or D, that the Australian dollar has depreciated because of a rise in foreign interest rates relative to the Australian interest rates. So what have you learned about demand factors in the exchange rate? So we're looking at things like exports, all right? Therefore, that's our sort of distractor up here in first one. We look at capital inflow into Australia and the speculation. So if we've got that in our mind, we talked about having an answer. So what causes a change in demand? If we look at D, because of rise in foreign interest rates relative to Australian interest rates. So what that would mean is instead of overseas investors investing or having capital inflow into Australia, because there's a higher interest rate in Australia, that would cause capital inflow. The opposite there would cause less capital inflow. So in looking at this particular question here, it looks like D is the stronger answer in terms of that, because there'll be less capital inflow because investors will reduce the inflow into Australia and seek higher interest rates overseas. In terms of B, looking at that, the micro reform, we tend to associate micro with supply side, and that, you know, that answer wouldn't match up there. All right, so let's move on. So that's just an example of our diagram questions. All right, another diagram question. Here we've got question 13. Pretty sure this is the 2018 exam. So the graph shows aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. So which of the following is most likely to reflect government policy designed to increase efficiency and equilibrium? So again, equilibrium output, all right? So equilibrium output. So there's key terms there, all right? So I'll just get the cursor again. So looking at that particular question, you need to make a decision about efficiency. Now, in your study, you would say that efficiency is supply side economics. So we're looking at a movement in the supply curve. And just be careful because it says equilibrium output. So we're looking at this axis here. So don't think that equilibrium is a higher level in terms of the intersection of supply and demand. So to me, it's a supply side question. So we can cross out demand. So we're left with, is it a shift to the left? So is it a shift to the left like that? Okay. Or is it a shift to the right? Now, looking at the question again, it's an efficiency, and you know that efficiency means lower costs and cheaper price. So therefore, that would be a shift to the right. So notice how we've applied just our knowledge in those questions and looking at the diagram. All right, so that's our multiple choice and some tips in that in answering our multiple choice questions. So let's move on to short answer questions. So the short answer is 40 marks overall. So it's a fair chunk of the exam, and it's one that students should, try to get maximum marks out of. And they do this by reading the questions carefully, looking at the verb in the question. So now we're going to pay more attention to the glossary terms that we've looked at in the previous email. Give more effort or analysis to questions with more marks, that's obvious. Be concise in your writing, use stimulus and examples. The way that exams have been moving in the last few years, they're trying to get students to write less, but write better quality. So that's a particular skill that you need to work on. You may need to interpret diagrams. The idea of not writing outside the lines in the last few years, because the exam papers are scanned by these very large scanning machines, the calibration of the machines tend not to pick up writing outside the lines on the paper. So just be careful of that. And there's always plenty of paper and extra paper to write on. And obviously, questions are using terminology. All right, so let's have a look at the first question here. And this particular question, it's a part B question. We can see it's worth 3 marks. And I've got here, it's a cross-topic question. So when we look at the question, we're testing our understanding of an appreciation and the effect on inflation in Australia. Now, we did some work on the glossaries terms of explain and why, explain, evaluate, etc. But this last few years, some of the questions have been asking how and why. So in our glossary of terms, do we know what how? So how means to show. So we need to show how, show this appreciation of the dollar and how it impacts on inflation in Australia. I've just screenshotted the marking criteria from the marking centre, and it just says clearly demonstrates how an appreciation of the dollar impacts upon inflation. Not giving too much away. We know we've got to do the how. It's a clear demonstration. So clearly means that there's no doubt in the examiner's mind that you've understood the link and you've detailed that link. So get into the habit of answering the question straight away. So looking at our sample answer, an appreciation of the US dollar is equivalent to a depreciation in the Australian dollar. When the Australian dollar depreciates, the value of the domestic currency is lower compared to other nations. That is, each dollar of the domestic currency buys fewer dollars of the foreign currency. So we've got a bit of a background to the concept of an appreciation in the dollar. This leads to imports from the US becoming more expensive in Australian dollar terms, and contributes to a general rise in the level of prices in Australia. So notice the question's asking for an appreciation of the US dollar, which you have to interpret then what's the effect on the Australian dollar. And you've clearly outlined that in that first part of the answer. So we don't just jump straight in and say that general level of price or inflation were to rise, and notion of imported inflation. We've built our answer around the fact that we've interpreted the appreciation of the US dollar first. So looking at that question, we're saying that the Australian dollar, we can buy less from the US, and therefore that's going to lead to higher prices or more expensive purchases of imports, and that's imported inflation. Sometimes in the short answer questions, you'll get calculations as well. You can see from last year's HSC, we've got a table and we've got answers parts A and B, and this is part A. So looking at the data, sometimes all the data in tables that are given are not used, other times they are. So just be careful there. So the question is looking at calculating the inflation rate 1 mark. So this should be relatively straightforward. We've got real GDP, we've got CPI, unemployment rates, and we've got a current account balance there. So you should know that your formula there for inflation, it's a rate of change. It's basically the change in the CPI from year 3 to year 2. Because we're asked to calculate year 3, we've got to look at the previous year. So the 132 minus the 110 is the change in the CPI, which measures inflation, divided by the previous year CPI. And we're timesing that by 100%, and that equals 20%. So just make sure it's clearly labelled there. All right, let's move on to some more questions. Last year's HSC again. Another verb that comes up often is this justify. So justify meaning you need to give reasons and detailed, clear economic reasons for whatever the question may be. So in this one here, appropriate monetary policy stance for this economy. Okay, and support your answer with reference to the economic indicators that are provided. Okay, so in this particular question I've taken out, the data suggests that there is a tightening of monetary policy. Okay, so in your answer, you would put the stance in the box provided. Okay, now I apologise we haven't got the actual data there to look at, but when you go back and have a look at last year's exam, that'll help you with this one, is you can see that from the data that the economies experience a growth, okay, and an appropriate response. So the GDP, there's increasing CAD, there's higher inflation as outlined in the question, and this would therefore indicate that the economy is growing quite quickly, and the monetary policy or interest rate stance would be to slow that down to keep it within our target band of inflation. So the answer, simply it's a 4 marker, so we need some support. The economy is experiencing growth, so we're talking about the indicators first that bring to the stance. So we're justifying the tight monetary policy stance or increase in interest rate or cash rate is because we've got high inflation, rapidly falling unemployment, and an increase in CAD as a percentage of GDP. The mechanics of it then would be the justification. The increase in the cash rate will reduce aggregate demand, decreasing output, hence slowing employment growth. This will decrease inflationary pressures. The slower growth will also reduce demand for imports and stabilise the cyclical component of the current account. Now, what you could do, and again, this is a sample answer from NESA, you could actually put in the data that's showing the increase in inflation, from the table from the previous question, to support that further. When we look at the criteria, it clearly supports an argument and the relationship between the indicators. So the progression of the criteria would then be supports an argument, give features of the argument, etc. All right, let's move on. So the next question here is 21C, and the question is explain the effects of a depreciating Australian dollar on accounts within the balance of payments. So remember from our previous video, we looked at an explain question on inflation. So we know that explain is looking at the cause and effects there. So here, what you're need to be doing is looking at the effects of a depreciating dollar on the balance of payments and specifically in accounts. So I've just highlighted there the word effects, which basically is what explain means. To relate cause and effect, the how and the why. So look at our sample answer, it's broken into two. And basically because we're looking at this depreciation on components of the balance of payments. So our first sentence answer is depreciation of the dollar will initially make imports more expensive, worsening the BOGs, the balance of goods and services. So straight away, depreciation, we've got the effect, more expensive, and we've got the component is the BOGs. In the long run, and this notion of long and short run is economics is very important in your answers. This will improve, the international competitiveness of our exports as it will require less of foreign currencies to purchase the same amount. Domestic consumers will also switch to domestic goods and services due to this cost factor. So that's the first part of our answer, looking at depreciation, making imports more expensive, worsening the BOGs, and then it talks about competitiveness. Our second part of the answer is that depreciation will make Australian assets cheaper to purchase and hence increase capital inflow. So that's on the financial account of the balance of payments, so a different component, although this may not be the case if further depreciation is expected. So we've got a little bit of in-depth analysis there. A depreciation will make our servicing of our debt, so our costing there, servicing costs, their denominating currencies more expensive, causing a larger debit, which is our major problem with our primary net income. So is it a comprehensive understanding? So we've got some CAFA and we've got some current account items. And again, there's a sample answer. Definitely this is not the best answer you can write, but definitely what do you notice about just clear, sharp sentences to the point, addressing the question? All right, let's move on to our stimulus extended response question. So what are some of the tips here? So most of the questions require you in the verb to make a judgment, okay? So obviously we've decided on which question of the two we're going to answer in our planning time. We've got our plan that should already be partly set up. We're highlighting the glossary term or the verb and the rubric that is above the question that you're going to get marked on. We need to consistently integrate. So sometimes students fall down by just mentioning at the end of a sentence what the stimulus material, how it helps the answer. So this notion of consistently integrating and referring back to the stimulus, our terms and concepts, theories, and make sure this in our rubric, it talks about a logical, sustained and cohesive answer. Okay, and I'm sure teachers done a bit of work on that. All right, this particular question from 2018, I apologise, it's quite small on the screen there, but you can pause this and have a good look at the question later on. So there are our two alternative questions in 2018. On the left there, we've got 25, which is assessing the extent to which the move towards free trade restricts the Australian government's ability to achieve its objectives of full employment, distribution of income, and external stability. In your response, refer to the stimulus provided. So on this side, we've got a trade type question on the objectives. On the other side, we've got the same verb, see that, assess, and that's not always the case. So we've got an assess, the extent to which, so same sort of idea, we're making a judgment based on size and value. And this one's on economic growth, okay, since the last recession in 91 to macro policy. Okay, so we've got a question on trade and objectives, and we've got a specific look at economic growth and macro policy. So when we look at our stimulus on our 25, we've got a quote there from Geoffrey Garrett, and obviously that's going to give us some idea on using this particular question about gains from free trade are dispersed while losses there send to be concentrated, and this response governments can attempt to compensate the losers. So we've got a bit of an idea there of what government restrictions and what they're doing there. Obviously, we've got our table here showing changes in manufacturing, construction, employment. So that's obviously a trade and looking at employment changes in terms of changes in Australia related to changes in trade potentially. Question 26, we've got our cash rate and budget outcomes. So we've got a fair bit of work to read and integrate into our answers there. Now, when we're looking at the rubric, again, this notion of sustained and logical and integration of this material is pretty important. Our marking criteria down the bottom, if we look at 25 first, you know, you'll see these words a lot. You can see the language is identical. Only thing that's changed is the aspect of the question. So this synthesis, you know, that's really detailed analysis and understanding of the information provided. So we talked about integration and clear, detailed integration. That's what the synthesis is. We've got our economic terms. So the two generic criteria in the marking is based upon the rubric. The only one that comes from the question is this clear and comprehensive understanding. And then we've got the question about the extent of free trade and how the government's their ability to achieve those objectives. And on this side, again, the extent to which economic growth can be attributed to, you know, fiscal and monetary or macroeconomic policy there. All right, let's move on. Okay, so what I've done here, and you can stop this later on, is just to give you a bit of an idea. So we don't have a lot of time in these videos to go through, you know, detailed answers to questions. So what I thought was a good way of preparation is just to have a look at past questions and put them into a table. So 2019 HSC, we've got questions on budget deficit. Sorry, we've got a question on budget deficit and its impact on economic growth and stability. The alternative question was on microeconomics and its impact on employment and inflation. So you would get to choose from that. Now, I don't have the verb in that. I'm just giving you the topics. So you can freeze this later on, pause it, have a look at the questions. And students often look for patterns or look at topics that have been tested as part of their preparation. So free trade, that was the question we just looked at, and that economic growth and impact, like government appropriate macroeconomic policies and how well that they've helped with the economic growth since the last recession. Question 2017, global economic activity on policies, economic policy. So, you know, we're looking at, you know, budget deficit policy, microeconomics policy, you know, free trade and economic issues, economic growth policies. So obviously it's a given that we need to know our macro and micro and labour market policies in quite a fair bit of detail. So labour market policies in 2016, conflicting economic objectives, and again, that would be linked to policies. We've got micro economic growth in 2015, and you can see the rest of those there. All right, let's have a look at this band 6. And I know I just went through the criteria there for the band 6 previously, but again, we're stressing this notion that your answer needs to include these areas generally to get into that 17 to 20 range. All right, so integrate economic terms, we've done that. This notion of a superior analysis, okay? So it's not just an explain type or a couple of effects. It's really in-depth understanding of the knowledge around the question. You know, the questions we looked at required judgment and reasoning. It's an assess question. Assess the extent, so to what extent. We're making judgments there. Vocab examples, economic policies, it's a given. So you really got to drill down on your macro, micro, labour, and how those policies affect and impact upon the issues, and even global issues as well. Mathematical concepts, obviously we've looked at some calculations, this notion of across topics. And I always say to my students, your ability to take one topic and to cross that over with another topic and make some sort of analysis and superior analysis and judgment around the connection really is where the high marks are. Okay. So these dot points here really come from the course descriptors in economics of getting a band 6. Structure of paragraphs, don't want to do too much on it, but just let's go over a few key points. We've got our hamburger there, bit of an analogy of looking at our peel sentences, and our paragraph structure. So we've got our topic sentence, we've got our elaboration. Just be careful on the explain because, we've already mentioned about what the explain question looks at, particularly if it's an assess question. But it's this elaboration. We're building on that topic sentence. We're giving clear evidence examples, integration of the stimulus in 25 and 26. And we've got plenty of linking sentences back to the question. Okay. So again, this is for you, just a bit of a refresher, and I'm sure the teachers have done plenty of work on this with you in class and giving you feedback around your structure. Remember from video 1, you're getting marks for the what you write, which is the content, and the how you write it. And the how should be clearly picked up in the structure of your answer and this evidence and elaboration part. All right, one of the things about being a good economics student and doing well is staying up to date with statistics. And we know that there's statistics coming out all the time. And where do we go to get these? So Trading Economics is a pretty good website for up-to-date statistics. And we can see there a lot of our stats are from December 19, March 20. Obviously, these are updated as we go. The reason why I like this overview one from Trading Economics is it gives you previous, looking at ranges, and it gives you little diagrams here. So like if you're a visual learner, you can see automatically, what's happening over time with that particular, whether it's growth, economic growth, or if you can see the government budget, obviously with deficit budgets, and they will continue with COVID-19. The Reserve Bank is probably, and the ABS are your major places to go. Ross Gittin's articles, UBS Economics. This is a snapshot from the Reserve Bank, and this is the latest one. And it's a really good overview looking at the main economic indicators, the cash rate at 0.25%, lowest level in quite some time. Our economic growth, 2.2%, although that's questionable as we're in middle of May here in COVID-19. Inflation, 2.2%. Unemployment rate, 5.2%. Now we know that that's recently changed to 6.2% with Scott Morrison coming out this week and looking at that particular rate and how that's increased, etc. Okay, so again, really good ready reckoner indicators there that we can use, put into our notes where possible. All right, so, another one is this new Reserve Bank snapshot comparison. So if you type in that in your search browser and you come up to this side here, that's a snapshot comparison. And what you do is you can select between time periods and different events in economic history, GFC, etc. And this particular one I chose was the GFC in September 2008 and automatically picked that event. And I did this in April, in May, but it come back to April, and then it compares it. So if you're looking at a change over time, this is a really good tool to compare. So for example, the cash rate at 7% in 2008 and 0.25%, it's a massive difference over that 12-year period. And we can look at key indicators and make some judgments there. Talking about the latest figures that come out in employment, this is from ABC News. So there's the statistics, the current ones with unemployment. I would imagine as time goes on, these would obviously become worse with what's happening with COVID-19. 600,000 people lost their jobs last month, hours cut back, etc. The current rate, 6.2%. Many economists and writers believe that it's still probably not a true reflection. 2.7 million people lost their jobs or had their hours reduced from the labour force. So these are, and if we recognise that as middle of May, as these indicators change over time, we can look at those changes. Let's have a look at extended response, so section 4 of the paper. 20 marks. Our plan has already been constructed from our reading time and our first 5 or 10 minutes of the exam. We've underlined the glossary terms. Make sure we address all parts of the question. So sometimes there's a cause and consequence, like the inflation question a few years ago, explain the causes and consequences. There was a CAD question, etc. Again, the weighting of that. You know, if it's the same verb at the start of the question for both, then, you know, typically there's equal treatment of both sections of the question. But sometimes students mention one and go into a lot of detail in the other. Not good in the marking of that. Terms, etc. So one of the things that we haven't looked at already is the use of diagrams in our answer. And they're highly encouraged. We're economists. We use diagrams and data all the time to interpret. So why wouldn't we be using them in our answers? We're not spending lots of time constructing them. So we've got to be pretty efficient at putting those in and clearly labeling. But it's got to be worth the effort. We're not going to spend 10 minutes drawing a diagram that we're going to refer to in one line. That doesn't make sense. All right, so let's have a look then at the 2018 exam. This is our rubric we're talking about up the top here. So again, if you're writing a good answer, you're showing your understanding, your knowledge, you're using the terms, and it's sustained and logical, etc. So question 27, evaluate the success of government policies designed to achieve environmental sustainability in Australia. Now, notice the verb here is evaluate, and in 28, it's assess. Now, I know they're fairly similar type questions, and when you're looking at the marking criteria down the bottom there, you will notice that the evaluate looks at this arguments to judge the success, where the assess is understanding of these factors. And again, assess is asking you to make a judgment, but in the rubric there, sorry, in the marking criteria, you can see that there's a bit of a difference between the two. All right. The second question on 28 looks at the importance of these factors. So again, if you're asking to assess the importance, we're making a judgment, aren't we? We're saying this factor is a large contributor to the size and composition of the CAD, or it's insignificant, whatever it might be. All right. We've already stressed the policies in looking at 25 and 26 in terms of those summary tables of past questions. So they're similar in the sense that we're making a judgment about how effective past policies, government policies, have been helping with the environment. And this one is assessing the importance of individual factors. So they're similar type questions in different topics. Again, I've constructed a table for you to look at, you know, that you can use, and again, in your preparation. So one of the things you can do is to overlay 25, 6, 27, 28, and you can look across the 4 alternative extended response questions that have been asked in the different years. I've just highlighted again topics. So we've got protection, policies, you know, there's a lot on policies, distribution of income, government policies was the one we looked at then, 28 CAD, globalization case study, major part of the course. So 2017 in terms of looking at the last time in an extended response question. Have a look at that question in 2017 because that particular question was not your regular globalization case study question, it actually asked you to compare the same globalization effects looking at Australia as well. Very different question to your straight out globalization case study question. Labour market policies, monetary. Interesting, 2015, our international organisations, IMF, etc. I know talking to students that year, that they were sort of steering clear of that and would rather prefer the external stability. And you yourself will know that what your strengths are in selecting these questions. Okay, let's move on. Here's a sample sort of paragraph. And one of the things that I suggest you do, that in preparation of doing the past papers we spoke about, sometimes it might be better for you, instead of writing a whole essay and giving that to your teacher for feedback, is you might just write paragraph answers to see whether or not you're on the right track. So this question here, we're assessing the effectiveness of macroeconomic policies in achieving economic objectives in the Australian economy. So the colour code is to say, well, this is how we're writing, okay, and this is what we're writing about. So the how is we're assessing, that's our verb, and we're looking at making judgments around the effectiveness, macro policy and government objectives. So when we read this answer, and I won't go through it in too much detail, but basically we've selected the macro policy of monetary in this particular paragraph. We've given a definition. It's always a good way to start. We're looking then at specifically that monetary policy is looking at interest rates, interest rate policy, and we've made the connection to price stability and economic growth that we're looking at. Notice the next sentence here that has been very successful in achieving price stability and economic growth. So interesting to see that we've got a conflict of sort of stability and growth. Usually one sort of goes, one goes up, like growth goes up and inflation also rises there as well. But early on in the paragraph, you're actually making a judgment. So you've identified your definition, your area, your objectives, and we're making a judgment. So then we would need to be using our peel, our elaboration and our evidence to support that. So we talk about keeping it within the target band, being effective in placing downward pressure on inflation, impinges upon its achievement of the objectives theoretically. That is, monetary policy is a blunt swing instrument. That's something you probably would have learned or will learn, and then talks about consumption, etc. So this leads to a reduction of disposable income and marginal propensity to save rather than to consume. So there's some judgment of effectiveness here throughout our paragraph answer. And again, you can stop this and have a good look at the answer. So the second part, I've just broken it down. It's not fitting on one screen just to make it easier to read. You can see again that there's lots of yellow there, this effectiveness, great success, not only in doing this, keeping inflation within the target band, but also sustaining growth, etc. So again, multiple references to objectives and multiple analysis there. We've got some statistics integrated into our answer, which what we need, and this really high level assessment of the effectiveness. And again, there's nothing wow about the answer. It's just short, sharp sentences usually, obviously good knowledge there of macro policy on monetary and the objectives, and definitely, you know, strong reference to assessment type language in your answer. All right, so that brings us to the end, it looks like, of looking at through the exam paper and the questions, etc. Hopefully I've given you some direction and advice, and you've got these videos that you can play back if I've spoken too quickly or you weren't sure on a certain section there, and giving you just some tips, etc., how to tackle the exam, and just some reassurance around what you're doing in your answering of the questions, etc. Okay, so thanks for watching the video, and hopefully that you'll get some benefit, and good luck with your HSC study.